So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Micaela Truslove, and I am the Community Wildfire Preparedness Coordinator here at Living with Fire. I have worked in Extension for about 10 years, both for Colorado State University and now UNR Extension. And most of the last 10, 15 years, I've been in environmental horticulture and urban and community forestry. So I love plants and I especially love trees. So hopefully this gives you some good information to take away, some good actionable stuff that you can do to create defensible space while protecting tree health. There we go. Cool. So we will be talking, we'll just have a really brief overview on defensible space. We'll talk a little bit about ignition resistant landscaping principles. So what you can do to maintain defensible space, get your property ready to receive fire. And then we really want to talk about this connection between plant health and defensible space. So how do I both, like keep plants out of the places I don't want them, but do that in a way where I'm not sacrificing plant health. And a big piece of this is tree, and I would say in general plant selection, placement, how we plant things to maintain health, and then maintenance. So maintenance is a huge piece of defensible space. And then I'll just talk really quickly about things that we often see in the landscape, ways that we hurt trees, and some ways to avoid that. And it looks like we do have folks who are industry folks, so hopefully we have we give you some tools to take away. Okay, so defensible space. This is a great photo from that was shared with me from Boulder County Wildfire Partners. This is the aftermath of the Cold Springs fire in 2016, and you can see where defensible space, the work that this community did spare homes. And so defensible space really is just that area in the home or around the home, around structures, properties, where vegetation has been maintained to kind of slow fire intensity as it's approaching those structures, but also to give firefighters a safe space, first responders a safe space to defend those structures if there are enough folks there. If there aren't, then your home is more likely to survive unassisted if you've done this defensible space work. And we often talk about defensible space in zones. So this is kind of our little conceptual way of saying, what you should do in each one of these zones. And we have an amazing defensible space guide. I highly recommend looking at that. It is on our website, livingwithfire.org. But these are as we're kind of walking through this, these are the zones I'm going to be using. So zone 0, our ember resistant zone, is really the zone that we want to see, if possible, no plants. But if you have plants, you want things to be low, not planted in front of windows or vents, and hardscaping is really best in this zone. Zone 1 is what we call the lean, clean, and green zone. So we want things lean, we want them well spaced. We don't want things real crowded in that zone. Clean, we want to keep the debris cleaned up, leaves, pine needles, things like that. And green, so we want things to be vigorous, healthy, well watered in this zone. And then the reduced fuel zone is our zone that is 30 feet and beyond from the structure. And this, we want to, make sure things are thin, spaced, as much as possible. We're keeping debris out of that area. And then very importantly, we really want to make sure that we're talking about community scale protection. And so I think, all of us have seen the enormous and devastating fires that have ripped through communities. And so they, once a fire makes it into a community, it moves from house to house to house. And so really, all of us doing this work as a community is what offers us the most protection. And we work within the Fire Adapted Communities framework, or we call it FACnet. FAC has a lot of great resources, so you can also look them up and look at those resources. So some of the landscaping principles that I want to talk about, and so this is a great example of what I'll talk about in a bit, ladder fuels. So, we have some junipers that have grown and eaten this lovely pine tree, and then the pine tree's dropping needles into the juniper. And so you can imagine if an ember landed in this situation, it would be really bad. So one of the things that we are really trying to get folks to shift away from having good and bad plants. There are plants that we definitely would rather not have in landscapes like junipers, but moving away from just plant this, not that, because there are so many nuances in the landscape. And so we really want to just push this idea. And if you're, come up in horticulture, right plant, right place, right? And so just selecting the right plant for the conditions and the goals in your landscape. So one of the biggies is size at maturity. So we don't want to plant something that's going to be, outgrow its space, and then we're going to have to prune it really harshly to get it back into place, and thereby lowering that tree's vigor. Soil conditions. We know we have some tough soils here in the arid West. So, that can really make plants struggle. Cold hardiness, so that's important here again in the high desert. So we want to make sure things, we're choosing things that can withstand those temperatures and temperature fluctuations. Heat tolerance, right? We know it gets pretty dang hot here as well. So we want, we're asking a lot of plants. We want them to be all the things. We want to think about exposure, so making sure that you don't plant something that doesn't love the reflected heat off your house on the southwest side. And we want to think about microclimates. So those microclimates can make a big difference to whether or not you can actually have a plant in that location. Water requirements, of course, are, it's something we have to think about more and more. And then important to this discussion, of course, is flammability characteristics. And so, again, avoiding those plants that have those flammable resins, waxes, things like that, like a juniper, versus a plant that has characteristics that make it less flammable, like low growing, open branching. It doesn't make a lot of debris, things like that. So these are some of our principles. So again, zone 0, that 0 to 5 feet from this structure, we really would love to see no fuels in that area. So hardscaping is the best choice. Breaking up continuous fuels. So we want to think about how fire spreads both vertically and horizontally. And so when we're talking about that vertical and horizontal spread, ladder fuels are a big piece of that, right? So fire gets carried from debris on the ground into maybe shrubs and small trees, and then into larger trees, and that fire crowns. It makes it much more dangerous and much more fast spreading. It spreads embers. So we want to avoid this situation. And then planting plants so that they're appropriately spaced at maturity. And so I'm going to keep hammering home this at maturity because I think, especially when you have a new landscape, you want that to look full right away. So you tend to jam too much stuff together. And then as things mature, they're all, everyone's growing on top of one another. And so we end up having to, again, harshly prune things or take things out, which, is a waste of time and money. And then using appropriate mulch. So, I think mulch is really important around trees. Using organic mulches is really important for tree health, for soil health. But that might not be the best choice in all areas, right? So limiting that mulch to areas where it's not going to cause problems. So again, this is my mature size, beef here, I guess. Spruce trees are a great example. So you see this cute little fuzzy spruce tree in the nursery, you want to take it home. It's like we find this cute little puppy. But then pretty soon that spruce tree gets enormous, right? So these guys can get real big. And so you are no longer have this cute furry little puppy. You now have this tree that has enveloped your house, your driveway, the sidewalk. And it poses a risk, right? So these guys are, of course, have those resins, those compounds that make them more flammable. And, in this situation where we have the big trees, it's growing right up against the house. So you're left with a dog or a tree that maybe you didn't quite plan or bargain for. So this is a situation where we really want to think about right plant, right place. Because what happens is then, and this is where we connect to tree health, you end up having to shave off the side of a tree, right? Because it's hanging over the sidewalk or you can't get in your car or your front door anymore. And this really compromises tree health. And once we do that, we start seeing dieback, and things become more flammable as they decline in health and things get a little bit more crispy. We have a lot more dead material. This is an example from the Davis fire that a homeowner graciously shared with us. And so this is a really great example of defensible space. The arrow is pointing to a tree that was scorched in that fire. So the fire came right up to the house. But because of the work the homeowner did, they were able, again, slowing that fire intensity down as it approached the house, slowing it down to the point that it stopped when it hit this landscape. So they have trees that are appropriately spaced away from the house. They do have junipers, not great, but look at where they're placed, right? They're up against a rock wall. They're sitting in these nice spread out clumps away from the house. They are maintained so the size is pretty small. They don't have a lot of dieback, although any juniper, if you look inside, probably has some surprises. But this is a really great, well-maintained landscape, appropriate mulch. It's inorganic. It's small diameters, so water can still get through. So this is a great example of what we're looking for. We pick on junipers a lot, and there's a reason for that. They're kind of the poster child of what we don't want to see in a plant, right? So they're super twiggy because all of their growth is on the outside where it gets sunlight. The inside tends to die back. Again, people don't plan for mature size, so they start encroaching on sidewalks, and then you have to shave them back, cutting off all those growing points, and you're left with this really unattractive plant that is also very flammable. So again, we want to think about lean, clean, and green, right? So healthy plants, they have that live tissue that's has a lot of moisture, and it's less ignitable. If plants are healthy, they do shed less, but every plant, of course, will burn, and plants just make debris. They just do. So there's no perfect plant in that sense. They're more fire resilient, so even if they do get scorched, they maybe will bounce back a little better. And then, of course, post-fire, we don't talk about this a whole lot until we experience it, but those tree roots, those plant roots really do us a service by keeping that soil in place post-fire. Again, stress plants, just drier, more brittle, a lot more debris. And so, those things can become more flammable. And they're also susceptible to other stressors. And so we'll talk about that mortality spiral that we see. So once we've shaved off the entire side of a pine tree or a spruce tree, we've now opened that tree up to more problems. So again, these are just some examples of some crispy, unhealthy plants. So this is what we're working to avoid here, thinking about and adopting a plant health lens. So this mortality spiral was first kind of described in, I think it was the 1980s, this model of thinking about plant health and how plants decline. And it was recently updated by Hilbert and colleagues, but this just kind of explains, right? So we start out with a healthy tree in the landscape. We choose our tree in the nursery. It looks great. We bring it home. And in this example, we plant it in a commercial site. So that's already tough, right? So their irrigation is probably not amazing. It might be in rock. It's probably in a parking lot. And it's probably in a planting bed with limited rooting space. And you can see kind of these things that it has going for it, right? So we can irrigate, we can manage nutrients, we could fertilize, we could do things that would help. We could apply plant growth regulators to keep that size in check. But as we're kind of thinking about these aggregating stressors, we start seeing dieback, we start seeing chlorosis problems because of nutrients or root issues in general. Maybe that tree then becomes more susceptible to pests and diseases. And then at that point, we start thinking, oh, shoot, we should do something. We need to implement our IPM or our plant healthcare plan. We bring a risk assessor in. By that time, it's just too late, right? So that plant gets removed either because we think it's ugly because it's declined so far, or because it actually dies. And so things like insects, right? We always like jump to the thing that seems that our brain thinks is the easiest, right? So we find in this case is a red-headed ash borer. We find these guys all over a tree, which I've had homeowners call panicked. These insects are crawling all over my tree. They've killed it. No, that ash is Elvis has left the building. That ash is gone. It's just that these guys come in and attack those trees that are already in decline. And that decline cycle started years and years before. So when we talk about the mortality spiral, so predisposing things, these are things that just, when we plant this plant that exists in the landscape. Inciting things are, or inciting factors are those acute stressors. So, we put in an irrigation system, we trench through the roots, something like that. Contributing. So now that we've stressed this plant out, it sends out those stress pheromones, and then insects, it's like a billboard for insects. So the insects move in. And then again, just thinking about that whole, this happens over sometimes many years, but that tree eventually succumbs to those accumulated stressors. So how do we keep plants healthy? So again, right plant, right place, so important. And then proper maintenance. So that just avoids these conflicts down the road. This example in this photo, these are, believe it or not, were our mock orange. This is near our office. So if you know mock orange, it's a beautiful shrub. I often, say this is a great replacement for juniper. It could be in this situation, maybe, but usually they're a pretty big shrub. These have been meatballed into, to within an inch of their lives. You can see they're just about alive. So that maybe wasn't the best choice. And then maintaining them so that, just choose a plant that's small to begin with, because these folks aren't meant to be pruned in this way. You can just see how twiggy and dead they've gotten. And so we sacrifice plant health to maintain size, to maintain, to kind of make plants be what we want them to be instead of selecting the right plant to begin with, and then they become more flammable. So you can imagine ember landing in one of those shrubs. So again, selection is super important. So as far as the Firewise piece, we want to think about plants that have water like sap. So, not the resins, not pitch. Leaves that have a lot of moisture, they're supple, you can bend them, they don't snap. Things that fit our landscaping goals. Again, if we don't want those big, beautiful mock orange to be big and beautiful, and we want them to be small, then we should probably choose something else. My example here of what I think is a nearly perfect plant is serviceberry. So it has 4-season interest. It has amazing fall color, beautiful structure. They come in all kinds of sizes from tree to shrub. So, just choosing something that maybe fits your space better. And then wrong plant, right? So these are some very sad arborvitae that were planted. It looks like there's irrigation in that bed. Not sure if it was ever on. They're up against a wooden fence. They clearly haven't been maintained. You can see all the weeds. This situation, you can, again, imagine if we're in a situation where fire is moving through a neighborhood from house to house. Maybe it gets disrupted by that brick post, but then you have those dead shrubs to carry it forward. So again, just thinking about plant selection, was that the best choice for this area? I would say probably this area, like some mulch, some rock mulch, right? No one's maintaining it. No one's looking after these plants. They look terrible. So maybe we just think of a different solution, and maybe that is simply nothing in this area. And so we often get asked, what is the perfect tree? What tree can I plant that makes beautiful flowers but doesn't drop fruit everywhere and gets, big enough but not too big? So I will just say there's no perfect tree. There are always trade-offs, but trees are wonderful. We should, we have very good research that tells us that trees are super, super important to our urban areas. And that, we should protect them. But there is no perfect tree. Everyone has, no one's perfect. Everyone has their drawbacks. But there are certainly, you can go talk to your nurseries. They love talking about plants, and they can help you pick something that's right for your space. And junipers. So we pick on junipers. So this is from the Marshall Fire burn area. These photos were shared with me by a master gardener that lived in this area. And she said, it was amazing. This house somehow was spared, except this juniper, they think probably caught some embers. The juniper ignited, but didn't, it just scorched, but it carried this fire up the side of this house. And just because of how vents work, right? So it sucked the flames in through that gable vent. And that second photo is the other side of the house. So it basically, she said it was like the homeowner said it was like a blowtorch coming out the other side, right? So again, had this juniper not been there to catch those embers, had it been sited correctly away from the house, this may not have happened. So the house looks okay, but there was a lot of damage to the inside. I believe it was not immediately livable after the fire, and it was really just because of this plant that had not been sited correctly. So we want to talk quickly about placement and planting. So again, we want to put plants where they will thrive, they'll be happy, they'll be green and clean. So this is a really great example. So I used to do HOA walkthroughs. So I would, HOAs would call me and say, can you walk our property with us and tell us, what changes we need to make, both just for plant health. And I also started doing these walkthroughs with Boulder County Wildfire Partners. So we would have both those perspectives. This is one of my favorite plants. So unfortunately it's in fall, the leaves have started to drop, so you don't get the full beauty of this, but it's a big tooth maple. It's a pretty small maturing tree. So, and they can be kind of shrubby. If you're from, the arid West, these are kind of a regional native. They grow all over the place, in canyons, places like that. Amazing fall color, but this is a really good choice for this landscape. Maybe not the shrub there that's growing underneath it, creating that ladder fuel situation, but it's in a little area of grass that's irrigated, so we don't really have to worry about embers landing in mulch underneath it. It doesn't get, this is probably its mature size. It has amazing fall color. It has beautiful bark. It's just a really great tree. So, we, again, minus the shrub, we don't really have much of a ladder fuel situation. You can't really tell, but it's, 10 feet away from the roof, the two roofs behind. It's small, so even if there were overhead power lines, maybe that tree isn't gonna, have a conflict there. You can still get in and out of your driveway into the backyard. It's not like eating all of your space. Soil conditions are probably all right here. It looks pretty good. And then, we're thinking about, it was kind of in a protected, I think this was an east facing side. So, it got up and going. It was kind of protected, and now it's just a really great plant. This, on the other hand, what is going to happen to this tree, right? So it's super cute and little right now. These folks had best intentions. They had ripped out a bunch of like weedy patches in front of the house, and they decided to plant a tree. So this is obviously not going to work long term, right? So you can think about this guy getting bigger. It's going to grow into the soffit. It's going to, it's just going to cause problems down the road, and probably have to be removed. So trees are expensive. A tree can cost around, generally $500 with purchase and planting. So we really want to make sure that we're putting those in the right place. This guy is in front of a window, which we don't like to see. It's right over the kind of the basement window there, which isn't, great. It's going to drop all those leaves into that basement window well. So just not a great place for that plant. Okay, so there is an adage, right, that you probably have to adjust for today's prices, but it's dig a $50 hole for a $5 tree. So we're going to talk a little bit about planting and why the planting portion of plant selection and placement is so important. So we know that trees, the highest mortality rate is during that establishment phase. So the first 1 to 5 years that we put a plant in the ground. And at this point, we really want to make sure that we're correcting structural problems. We're giving that tree the best chance to live. And of course, our urban landscapes are really challenging. We have a ton of compacted soils. Our soil issues in urban areas, I think, are, just one of our biggest challenges, especially if you're in a new development that has just been, machines have run across that land so many times. You just have terrible soils. The topsoil's been scraped off. It's been filled. You have no idea what's in there. And then, of course, again, in the arid West, getting plants up and going can be a real challenge. So again, trees are really expensive to purchase and to plant. And also, again, this can happen over many years. So once they get really big, they also get really expensive to remove. So we really want to make sure we're giving those trees the best chance at survival. And this starts with selecting good nursery stock. So when we're in the nursery, we want to look for things like, is the trunk damaged? What does the branch structure look like? Are the branches really broken, which can happen in transport? Often you see, areas on the trunk where it's been, the trunks or the tree's been mishandled and it has a lot of trunk damage, which of course disrupts nutrients and water flow. Do we have girdling roots that we can see already? Has the plant been, or has the tree been potted up to the point where it's way too deep in the root ball, which is what we often see. And so we want to look at trees, we have this example of bad or poor quality nursery stock, good and best. So we want to choose something where we have a lot of options going forward. So the best quality there, you can see we have a ton of branches to select from as we're shaping that tree. Strong central leader, we can work with that. Good quality is maybe we are starting to see those co-dominant branches. So, something to look out for, but we can do some correction and that tree will probably be just fine. But then we get into these other trees where, it's just going to be a real challenge to ever get anything good out of some of these these crown structures. So just starting with the best. I wiggle stuff, like nurseries don't love it, but I go around and I wiggle the trees in their just gently, very gently in their pots to make sure they're rooted well. I want to, kind of dig down and see how far up the soil's been mounded around that plant and if I can see circling roots. I don't want things that are pot bound that haven't been well watered. So just being really, really selective in your plants. Again, most plants come out of the nursery potted or buried far too deep. So when we're planting, we want to excavate that root ball to find our first structural root, which we want to place within an inch of the soil, the top of the soil. So this means a lot of the time, removing a bunch of soil from the top of the plant. So you can see that pink line on the tree. If you can, it's pretty faint, but that first arrow is where the soil line was in the pot. So much too high. And then you can see that first structural root. So we've had to remove, 4 to 6 inches of soil to find that first structural root. And so we want to correct those root problems at the beginning, right? So while we can see the plant before it goes into the ground, we want to look and see where we have those circling roots, which will, if left, girdle the plant, right? So it will constrict the plant. It's like putting a rubber band around your arm or a tourniquet. And as the plant grows, it'll cut off nutrient and water flow. And so we can see this, early. We can correct some of these things early. So when we put the plant in the ground, it has a better chance of survival. And so there's a post-mortem example there on the left where that plant, obviously the roots weren't corrected. And you can just see how terrible that root structure is. So they're growing down, not out. The roots have grafted together. They're all growing underneath and twisting around, constricting one another. So this is what we do not want to happen. That is probably a major, again, those thinking about those inciting, contributing factors, that was probably a big factor in that tree's decline and eventually death. So root ball shaving. So this can be kind of controversial. But there has been good research that shows that this actually doesn't hurt the plant. Again, we don't want to just throw it into a poorly dug hole and not water it after this. It's pretty stressful. But This does correct some of those circling roots. We just want to, we call it the box cut. So you can cut it on 4 sides very carefully, very gently. And I kind of just correct roots as I'm going. Sometimes you don't have to take as much off. And this just, again, encourages those roots to grow out and not around. And then we want to check the planting hole depth. So again, this is after you've checked to see how deep that tree is in the pot, removed excess soil. Now, how deep do I need my hole to be? So we want that root ball resting on firm soil. So we want to dig the hole no deeper than the root ball. I even plant my trees a little proud. So an inch or so above grade, just to give them room to settle, which they often do. And again, we want the sides of that planting bowl to be saucer shaped, so slanted, and if you're in a clay area, just digging the hole can really glaze the sides of the hole. So, you get almost like a clay pot. So you just want to rough those sides up to make sure the roots can grow out into that soil. And then we always want our hole to be 2 to 3 times the width of the root ball. Fill our hole, water. Please do not step on the soil. I know this is a common practice, but if that soil is wet and you're stepping on it, you're destroying the structure. So just gently watering things in as you're filling the hole, creating a berm so that it holds that water. And then mulch. Again, there's caveats here, but organic mulch around the root ball, not on the root ball, is a great thing to do for trees. So Tim Buchanan, it was the city forester for, I think, over 40 years in the city of Fort Collins. And he used to always say good things happen to people who mulch. So I loved that saying. So in general, we want to do 3 inches deep, 3 feet wide, 3 inches away from the trunk. I would argue a little bit more is better. So you want about a fist's width between the trunk and where your mulch starts. So again, we want to be careful of organic mulch in zone 0. So maybe we have this mulch ring that's, 3 feet wide if we have that space. And then, we have inorganic material, some kind of rock mulch around that. And so this is the Marshall Fire burn area. You can see that the turf, it was in winter, of course, it was in December, early January, last days of December. The turf is fine, but that mulch did burn. So, so this stuff is flammable. We want to be careful. UNR actually has a great publication about landscape mulches for fire resilience. So we can send that around after the webinar. But we don't want to see mulch volcanoes, right? So this is an extreme example, but again, we want to make sure that we're not entirely cutting off oxygen, water moving into the soil, because what that does is it creates, again, the situation where we have girdling roots. So there's not enough oxygen getting into the soil. The tree starts to put roots up at the surface because it needs that oxygen. And then we start seeing this situation where roots are starting to circle around the tree. So that's what happened with this tree in the middle. We pulled, the tree was declining. You can see it has all kinds of trunk damage anyway, probably string trimmer. And then we found these circling roots. And then again, on the far right, the mulch has just been sitting wet up against this trunk, which has started to cause those tissues to rot. So again, giving that 6 to 8 inches berth around the trunk, just so you're not causing those problems. Staking is another really controversial thing, right? So there are people who are super big proponents of staking. And we want to make sure that if we are staking a tree, there's a reason. So sites that are windy, if we're planting on a slope and we need some stability until the roots become established, if the plant, again, like gently wiggling in its pot, you notice that plant is not stable in the root ball, or the root ball's been damaged. So, you're trying to get it into the planting hole, everyone's done it, you accidentally drop and shatter the root ball, right? So now we need those roots to reestablish. So maybe we use stakes, but we absolutely want to remove those stakes after the first year. Trees have to be able to sway in order to develop trunk taper. So this is where that, that the reaction wood that kind of makes that trunk strong develops. And so that tree has to be able to move in those stakes. So staking loosely, just making sure that that tree just has just enough support that it doesn't fall over, but it can still move. Burlap and metal cages, another crazy controversial topic. So we always hear, well, burlap just breaks down, right, in the soil. Well, if you live in the Northeast, maybe that's true, or would they have acidic soils? It does not break down in our dry alkaline conditions. People say, well, won't the roots just grow right through the cage? There's all those great big gaps. So the burlap's going to decompose and then the roots are just going to go right through the cage. That does not happen. Again, the burlap does not decompose. The roots circle in that burlap. They don't get through the cage. That cage constricts and girdles that, the roots, and now we have a dead tree. And so we really want to remove at least the top 2/3 of the burlap and the cage at planting. This is an example. So this was a property where they had planted probably 8 to 10 really big spruce and other evergreens. They were declining. They thought they had an insect issue. Again, those are the folks that always get blamed. And then we came out and we started digging around the base of the tree, and we found this burlap sticking out. We dug down and we found that these trees were placed in the ground with the cage and the burlap intact. And so, these plants had irrigation. They spent a ton of money paying for them to get planted, and they were planted improperly. I don't know if these trees lived. Our suggestion was, they'd only been in there a year. If you're willing to dig them out and remove that burlap and cage, then maybe, but probably at that point, that tree isn't going to come back at the top. You're going to have to maybe establish a new leader, but that tree's structure is now, permanently damaged. So maybe it's just best to remove and start over, which is a really big, expensive mistake. Again, this is just a graphic explaining what we want to see. So top 2/3 of that cage removed, and the burlap removed, and the roots kind of placed out into the soil as best you can. Pruning is such an insanely big topic. This is the very, very scratching the surface basics, right? So why do we always want to have a goal before we start pruning? Always, always, always. So, in some cases we're doing it to maintain tree health. In others, like for defensible space work, we want to get that plant away from our roofs, our gutters, things like that. Rejuvenation pruning is a thing. If you have an old tree that has a lot of water sprouts or hasn't been pruned in many, many years, getting that tree structure back into shape. Canopy raising, so again, important for defensible space. However, we want to make sure that we keep at least 3/4 to 1/3 of the crown intact if we're crown raising. This is super important when it comes to evergreens. And so we don't want to take up so much of the tree that we end up with a little tiny umbrella and all, trunk. That's really, really hard on those trees. And so again, we just want to have that goal in mind before we start. So here's our example again. We want to start when trees are young. So if possible, we just want to start, developing a good structure while that tree is young. Always, feel free to always remove dead, diseased, or dying. So the 3Ds. So any of those branches aren't serving the tree any longer. So do remove those. Anything that's crossing or rubbing, that's just going to cause issues as the wind is blowing, which it does a little here. We want to make sure that we're getting rid of those problems right away. You don't want to remove any more than 1/4 of the foliage each year or each pruning. So, I just make a brush pile as I'm going along so I can see how much I've taken out. And then again, those evergreens really, as much as you can, not limb them up, site them where they can do their thing. But if they're closer to a house, they are existing in a landscape. Our recommendation is 6 to 10 inches, or sorry, inches, 6 to 10 feet off the ground. But if you have to do that and it leaves less than, again, that 2/3 to 3/4 of the crown, it might just be better to remove and replace, because you start impacting tree health. And we never ever want to top trees, ever, never. People say, oh, well, they grow back and they're so full and healthy. That's, of course they're going to, because you've just starved them. They have no leaves to make any food. And so the first thing they're going to do is use so much energy to try and replace the crown that was removed. And this, every time I see this, it literally just like, it is such a gut punch. It's so harmful. Yes, I hear people say, well, that's what they do in Europe. Yes, there's a very specific reason. It's called pollarding. There was a very specific reason that was done. It still impacts tree health, and it's really, really harmful. So we want to, as much as we can, if you are working on trees, if people are, if you're a homeowner and an arborist is going to come work on your tree, you just want to make sure that you specify how it's going to be pruned, and you want to make it super sure that they are not, doing harmful things like topping. So when we talk about pruning, we're really talking about how can we work with a tree's natural ways of closing those wounds. And so natural target pruning cuts. So all of that means is we're going to cut in locations that preserves the cells that can close those wounds. So we're just working with the tree instead of against it. We make our pruning cuts. This is just a really, really basic diagram. It's super, super simple. So we're going to undercut at A. So that just means we make a small cut at the bottom of the tree. And what that does is we're going to remove then the weight, the heaviest part of the branch at B. So we're going to cut through the branch. And as you're cutting through the branch from the top down, you're going to notice that branch is going to want to tear. And so it's going to hit that cut at A. It's going to stop tearing. It's not going to tear into the trunk and into, again, that area that can close that wound. And then that final cut at C is where we're going to take that branch off entirely. So the branch bark ridge is where the branch attaches to the trunk, and it's just the tissue that kind of accumulates as that branch and the trunk grows. So it's just that wrinkled area at the top of the branch. And then the bark collar, or the branch collar, should say branch collar, is the swollen area underneath. And this area is where all of those cells live that can close and properly compartmentalize a wound. And so that is the area we want to preserve. And so if you can't see it, some species, it's really clear, others it's not at all, where the branch collar is. So a good kind of rule of thumb is going perpendicular to the top of the branch from that on the outside of the branch bark ridge. And so that's where we're going to make that pruning cut. So again, those tissues can close the wound. This prevents further decay into the trunk, into the tree. And that's, it's just super important that we want to preserve that branch collar. Branch collar. Good job. Okay, branch collar. And when you'll hear this term coat-it, or compartmentalization of decay in trees, the important thing here to remember is just that trees do not heal in the way that people do, right? They're like our skin, we get a cut, it heals. Trees always carry these wounds within the tree. And so they just are able, again, you can see where there was damage, probably storm damage or something. And this wound will always exist in the tree, but the tree has successfully closed that wound over. You can see the dark areas where, the tree has mobilized these compounds to stop the decay from moving in. Trees are really amazing. They have the resources to do this as long as they have the energy, because we take care of them well. Folks always say, when should I call an arborist? My recommendation is anytime your feet have to leave the ground. We really don't want to see folks being unsafe on ladders. Actually had an uncle that passed away because he was pruning trees and fell off a ladder. This happens. It's very dangerous. And so, you can see arborists, example on the left, they have all the proper safety gear. They're clipped in. They're being very, very safe. They know what they're doing. And so if you have to leave the ground for any reason, it's just best to call an arborist. You can find an International Society of Arboriculture certified arborist, which is really what we want you to do, by going to treesaregood.org. And that's the ISA website. There's a Find an Arborist feature there. And I'm just going to zoom through this last part. I think we've kind of touched on a lot of this. So we really want to just talk about some of the common things we see, right? And so root injury is such a big one in our urban areas. Again, compacted soils. So that's what's happening on the left. A good indication, weeds. We have indicator weeds. So some weeds just really like certain conditions. This thistle loves compacted soils. This is Canada thistle. And this tree, it's so compacted that these roots cannot make it out into the soil. And so they've started to circle around. Trenching through the tree roots. So tree roots are 2 to 3 times as wide as the tree is tall. And that is always a shock to people. 2 to 3 times as wide as the tree is tall. So those roots are super wide. Most in the top 12 to 18 inches of the soil is where all the important roots that absorb water and nutrients are. So if you do this, this is basically a death sentence for these trees. A lot of damage there. Planting too deep is another thing that we see so common in our urban landscapes. Again, nutrients and water can't get into the soil. You're causing issues because that trunk is exposed to moisture and you can cause rot. This is a great example on the far right. You can see where the proper planting depth is at the bottom. You can see where this tree was planted. So that was the planting level. And then the mulch is like a foot deep. So this tree obviously, lived for a while. This is not a tiny tree, but it probably succumbed eventually to something. But that first factor was probably the planting depth. Girdling, so many ways that plants get girdled. So again, this is disrupting, damaging the trunk to the point where the tree cannot move water and nutrients up and down. String trimmer damage is a biggie. That's another reason we mulch. We create mulch rings because then you don't have to get close to the tree with a string trimmer or a mower. Again, that mulch example, those roots are going to grow around the tree. As the tree grows, they're going to cut into the trunk and girdle the tree. Staking straps, irrigation that doesn't get moved as the tree grows, leaving plant tags on, all of these things really shorten the life of a tree. Watering is so important in the arid West. And so, we want to water, and winter watering, incredibly important here. So we want to make sure this tree is receiving adequate water. Trees are not drought tolerant in the sense that other plants like xeric plants are drought tolerant. They need water. So, daily, once it's planted, check the soil, stick your finger in the soil, make sure that there's water in that soil. You want it to be as wet as a wrung out sponge. Once that tree is established, the recommendation is 10 gallons per diameter inch per irrigation event. That's clear as mud. An irrigation event just means anytime you water, and that's going to change based on the season. So in the summer, you're going to need to water more. In the fall, in the winter, less, but you're always going to water through the winter. Again, the best way to know if there's moisture is to check, 8 to 12 inches down, just check the soil moisture, dig a hole, the best way to check. Sun scald is a big deal here. This is just the reflected heat. This tree's gone dormant. We have a sunny blue day like we do in the winter. That reflected heat off the snow or the sidewalk warms up the cells enough that they wake up, and then the temperature drops at night. They freeze. The cells explode, and then we get these sunken areas. Again, this part of the trunk is no longer operating. It's no longer moving nutrients and water, so that damage is permanent. Wrapping from I just say Halloween to tax day is a good way to think of this. So this is what I was taught coming up in the tree world, and And so tree wrapping is just super important, especially for young, thin bark trees. How long you wrap really just depends. When you start, developing that thicker bark, then you can stop. But really, the first couple of years at least, this is so important. So in summary, we just want to think about lean, green, and clean in our landscapes when we're talking about trees. So again, we want to think about, giving plants the site or the space they need to get to maturity without having to do drastic pruning. We want to, again, always think about removing dead, diseased, or dying branches. These, again, that brittle material, that dry material, as much as we can keep that out of the tree, that really, really helps with our fire, our creating defensible space. We want our trees to be nice and moist. We want them to have a lot of water. There was a new study that suggested, and I think we have a ton more to learn, but just suggested that, they looked at fires, they looked at imagery before and after fires, and they noticed in that imagery that where there was a well cared for, mature shade tree, deciduous tree, those tended to offer some protection from embers. Like I say, this is not definitive, this is not like set in stone, but that's a pretty heartening thing when, we have this debate of, well, we just have to cut down all the trees in our defensible space. Maybe not, right? Let's just keep them lean, green, and clean. And then do everything you can to help your tree thrive from the beginning. Putting the tree in the right place, choosing good, healthy planting stock that you're not going to be fighting, the life of the tree to keep it in good shape. Correcting defects early, planting correctly, give it, that first 5 years, really pay attention. And then pruning when necessary. And then, know when to hire an arborist. So if you have something that's tricky, if you have to get up on a ladder, just hire a certified arborist. Use that ISA resource. And then avoid those common mistakes, planting too deep, trenching through the roots, compacting the soil around the roots, just being really, really careful, especially in the drip line. And that's all I have. So thank you so much